So what if Dangerous Eldritch Star Deities, but now massively harder to kill? Let's talk about the power of the CTan, and why it looks like they're going to be popping up in just about every Necron competitive list going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons once more, and in this video I thought we'd focus on the CTan Shards, the fragments of fractured gods that Necrons bent to their will, and now used as pop-up thralls on the battlefield, unleashing their eldritch might on unsuspecting foes. These guys are just looking ridiculously strong in the new Necron Codex, so in this video I thought we'd talk through each CTan in general, and then some of the positives and negatives of each one of them, and a few options for supporting them in game. In the recent Necron Codex, lots of things did get boosts. Things like Wraiths and Immortals can do some fairly scary combos with characters now, though just for sheer raw might and easy usability, the CTan perhaps seem like the single biggest winners out of the Codex, I'd say. Models that were really quite dangerous and not too hard to include anyway, but now just getting an enormous durability increase at no extra points increase whatsoever, and they just really feel like models that are kind of impossible to go wrong with. Prior to the Codex dropping, the CTan certainly were seeing play. Due to the way that things worked before, it was usually the Transcendant CTan with the Sempiternal Weave, but other ones like the Void Dragon, Nightbringer and Deceiver were all seen playing well placed in competitive lists as well, just not quite as commonly. They definitely weren't auto-include, but seemed good enough to see some use. In the Codex they saw a few changes, though the main one is gaining a 5+ Feel No Pain type save, something that I felt almost certainly would come hand in hand with a points cost increase. But then when the Codex digital points came out, it turned out that that wasn't the case. The only thing that they'd traded out for that was a -1 inch to their movement, which isn't ideal, but it's not game-breaking either. But a 5+ Feel No Pain on top of their other durability things that they have going on already is just kind of mad. The way that Feel No Pain type saves work out is that that's effectively a 50% increase in durability, and that's on top of being really quite tanky models already. Toughness 11 with 12 wounds, a 4+ invulnerable save, and that Necrodermis special rule that didn't go away for already halving damage. Say for example if they got hit by a damage 6 shot, that'd get halved to a damage 3 even if they failed the save to start with, and now with the Feel No Pain you'd on average pass one of those further wounds, so failing a save against a damage 6 weapon on average only takes 2 wounds off, which is kind of crazy. Previously the standard CTan profile would have taken 14 las cannon hits to bring down, now it needs 22, and that's not paying any attention to the ones that miss. Given just how resilient they are, unless you're focusing an entire army's firepower on them, they're probably going to at least survive one turn where they're partially damaged, and that means that they get reanimation protocols as well, and every wound that's restored on a CTan is just going to be massively hard to take off. D3 wounds healed is pretty painful when on average that's the same amount as a damage 6 failed save would do. It's already quite scary for a model that's just over 250 points and isn't really that big a commitment to add to the army, and it means they should be around to do what they want to do for a few turns. Their main weakness, I'd say, is that they are quite slow. They did lose 1 inch of movement down from 7 inch to 6, so if the opponent just wants to play keep away and try and ignore them as best as possible, that's usually going to be a good idea. I feel like they just need to play aggressively though and go towards midfield objectives if they are just starting on the board, force the opponent to actually have to come into contact with them and deal with their massive stats. Plus the Hypercrypt Legion gives them other interesting ways to get close if you happen to be playing that formation. Currently in game, basically I feel like 1 or 2 CTan is unlikely to be ever a particularly bad choice for Necrons with these kind of stats, and I feel like at least some lists will probably be running more than this. I guess it doesn't hurt as well that the Deceiver and the Nightbringer are just very cheap in terms of cost for the model for the points on the table. One of the easiest ways to get a Necron army up to say 2,000 points if you wanted to. They are at least fairly easy to access from that perspective, and the Transcendant CTan, while not as easy to get a hold of the official model, is something that feels like you could easily kit bash out of all sorts of things if you got a bit creative. That one's just supposed to be a random fragment of a star god, so you could very much make one with your own thoughts and personality, just roughly the same size as the one from the Tesseract Vault kit. Getting into the CTan individually though, first up we've got the CTan Shard of the Deceiver. He's 265 points, has the standard CTan stat line but gets objective control 6, and his attacks are a Cosmic Insanity sniping attack that can be okay against lighter infantry as well, and Golden Fists in melee at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. Otherwise he gets a couple of other special rules, Stealth for a -1 to hit at range, and Grand Illusion to allow you to reposition Necron units, potentially putting them into strategic reserve if it makes sense. The Deceiver definitely has some good things going for him. The biggest draw is that he is the toughest one essentially. Stealth basically adds yet another barrier to damage, so the enemy is going to be -1 to hit before they have to deal with all the other nightmarish things they have going on. and having a flat damage 3 attack in combat does give him kind of uniquely good damage against medium and heavy infantry. He's the single best at smashing standard size Space Marines, and it's kind of on par with the Nightbringer for taking down Terminator profiles. Otherwise, I guess OC6 is handy enough if you just want a little bit more pressure on objectives. Occasionally that might swing a point from your opponents to yours, though maybe a little bit more unreliably. I feel like overall though, perhaps his general profile does feel like a Catan that's kind of hard to kill but maybe not all that threatening compared with some of the rest. I feel like he's sort of paying for his redeploys lumped into the bargain, which makes sense, so the big redeployments maybe aren't quite as powerful as some other versions of that rule might be, as you have to make all these redeployments before first turn's determined, so you don't have the perfect knowledge to put all your Necron units super aggressive or super defensive. You just need to reposition a bit, not knowing whether you might go first or second. Still definitely could be handy though, if you can just move anything slightly to mean that you're a bit more safe if the opponent goes first, but you're still in a position to hit the enemy hard if you do, then all well and good. And I guess you could try and do some misdirection type things. If the opponent has tried to counter-deploy you in some sort of way, then putting things randomly into strategic reserve or onto the other side of the battlefield could really quite annoy them there. For downsides though, I feel like he does pay for that and his toughness for probably being the worst overall damage dealer out of them. The sniper attack's okay and could give you a chance of sniping out a support character out of a squad, though even then it's not reliable. You'd average around about 3 wounds on a character. And if he does get in combat with anything that's toughness 9 or more, then his damage output's quite bad. He only averages about 6 wounds against things with a 3+ save, never mind 2+ saves or invulnerable saves going on. Between all that, he was probably the one that was played the least out of them prior to the Codex update, but still did turn up in competitive lists. Next up, and seeing the biggest improvement in the Codex, is the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer. He's 255 points, and basically is the big damage Catan. Not really doing anything too subtle, but he just basically packs a whole load of attacks that can threaten anything in the game. His Gaze of Death is strength 12 with a damage d6 plus 3 on the shooting side of things, so a big threat to enemy heavies there. And that side of the Nightbringer is just enormous damage against any one thing. 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 2 with devastating wounds, enormous threat against heavies there. And he can swap it out for a sweep mode that's remarkably good at killing standard sized Space Marines. Recently I did a video on the channel with the avatar of Kane fighting against every 40k faction leader, and the Nightbringer was featured there. I honestly think that given the increase to his damage output with the d6 plus 2 damage, and also getting the 5+ feel no pain, the Nightbringer is probably the single best one-on-one brawler in all of Warhammer 40k for his cost right now. Just absolutely enormous damage and absolutely enormous defense. If he's in melee with any one opponent, then he's probably going to do more damage than his cost, though of course he does pay for that a bit in having slow movement, and doesn't provide any boosts or synergies or things to the rest of your army. Otherwise he also has a drain life rule for a 4+ to deal d3 mortal wounds to all enemies within 6 inches at the end of the fight phase. I think given both the feel no pain and the increase from damage d6 to damage d6 plus 2, the Nightbringer is going to be a really popular model to include going forward. Just for his average damage output against a 3+ save vehicle, he'd average around about 18 wounds to just about anything, so should have a pretty good chance of one-shotting something like a Space Marine Repulsor if he caught one. He kills around about 6 or 7 standard Space Marines with his sweep mode, and he backs that up with fairly strong damage from Gaze of Death and Drain Life. Being the cheapest Catan on top of all that is just added value. Overall, pretty strong stuff from the Nightbringer, not really too many weaknesses. Unless you prefer some of the utility or powers of the other Catan, I feel like just about every Necron list could happily include him, and you wouldn't really be able to go too far wrong with enormous damage and enormous defense, moving towards a midfield objective point. If you wanted to go a little bit more for hunting vehicles though, the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon definitely has immense value too. He's slightly more points at 270, and is the other one that gets quite high strength on his attacks, well able to threaten enemy monsters in combat, and massively so against vehicles. At range, he gets d6 plus 3 shots with the Voltaic Storm, strength 7 at AP 1 and damage 2, so quite nice for clearing out hordes and Space Marines there. That also has sustained hits 2 as well. Gets to throw the Spear of the Void Dragon that has anti-vehicle 2+ and damage d6 plus 2, but only strength 4 against other things. And in melee he has sweep and strike modes with the Void Dragon Spear that isn't quite as powerful as the Nightbringer, but again comes with anti-vehicle 2+ and a flurry of Tailblade attacks to help handle hordes. Finally, he has a rule called Matter Absorption. At the start of his shooting phase, he gets to select one enemy vehicle within 12 inches, deal d3 mortal wounds to them on a 2+, and heal himself by that same amount. Overall, between all that, I feel like he's generally inferior to the Nightbringer if you're not fighting against vehicles, but superior if you are. His raw numbers in combat maybe aren't quite as impressive, still doing 16 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle or around about 4 or 5 slain Space Marines. The Voltaic Storm should do a bit more work against standard Marine infantry and more Horde type targets, plus the single big hitting anti-vehicle attack is quite good at range. If you can use the Drain Life thing as well, that could be really quite a big swing, both dealing extra damage and also healing himself for D3 wounds that are very hard to kill are both really good. I guess the main disadvantage with him is that he's not quite as general purpose. He should be okay against infantry given that he's got lots of extra attacks, but he's still not going to feel quite as overwhelming if he doesn't have vehicles in the enemy army to kill, though it'll be kind of godly if he does. Lastly, we've got the Transcendant CTan, maybe the one that got the biggest side grade in the Codex rather than direct upgrade. Previously, people tended to field him with that Sempiternal Weave, and with that under the old points, he would have been 310 points for a CTan with a 4+ Feel No Pain type save. Now he's dropped down to 275 points for one with a 5+ Feel No Pain. He basically trades in a bit of raw damage output for being the teleporting CTan. He gets the Deep Strike special rule, and when he advances, he gets to teleport across the table to set up somewhere greater than 9 inches from enemy units. He'll still be able to shoot with his Seismic Assault, though he won't be able to make a charge the same turn. It does mean that he could put himself in a threatening position where the opponent is going to have to try and deal with him a bit more urgently, and maybe threaten a favourable area of the board where things can't kill him quite so well, or he's got some good targets that his damage profiles are good against. On the offensive, his Seismic Assault gets 6 shots at Strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3 at range. That's all with sustained hits 1 as well. Fairly nice for threatening medium or heavier infantry there. And in combat he strikes with his Crackling Tendrils, again sustained hits 1, Strength 9, AP 3 and damage D6. Maybe somewhat comparable with the Deceiver there, but not quite as reliable against 3 wound targets, as damage D6 gives you the chance to fail to kill things like Terminators. He's also not an epic hero as well, so you could take multiple if you wanted to. Even though he hasn't directly improved in the Codex, I feel like given that a solid essentially 35-point drop from how he'd be fielded before still makes him an interesting pick. The option to teleport allows him to move forward and just annoy enemy units, and that kind of gets around the main weakness of the other CTan, that they only move 6 inches per turn, so the opponent might just try and fall back and ignore them for a turn or two. And having the Deep Strike keyword could actually be kind of handy in the Hypercrypt Legion. Even if he could get the repositioning anyway by paying 1 command point, this could allow him just to use the normal detachment rule to redeploy anywhere on the table. And as well as being able to shoot, he'd also be able to at least have the chance of a 9-inch charge, which could be quite a big deal given his melee profile. In combat he is going to be mainly just threatening heavier or medium infantry though. His ranged attack isn't terrible, but in melee he slays around about 2 Terminators or 4 or 5 standard issue Space Marines. He's not going to be taking apart battle tanks and things in the same way that the Nightbringer or the Void Dragon does. He is also just the most expensive, though admittedly there's not too much in it, it's only 20 points more than the cheapest, but I guess that's a small mark against him. Overall, I'd say that between all that, the CTan are all looking really quite playable, depending on which ones you want to fill out your particular list. I'd say that perhaps the Void Dragon and the Nightbringer are maybe the single easiest to use, just literally point them at the enemy and let them go. Their raw damage and defense is just enough to make them threatening, and it just depends whether you want to trade out a bit of raw threat for the Deceiver's extra durability at range and his redeploys, or the Transcendent CTan's ability to bounce himself around the table and make his presence felt nice and early. I'd say for the most part, they're just kind of happy doing what they do and don't really need to be built around too much compared with other Necron units, and I'd focus on the main detachment buffs and things for other stuff in the army, kind of depending on exactly which detachment you're playing. Maybe the single biggest thing for the CTan out of the Codex perhaps is the Hypercrypt Legion though. That's the one that basically allows them to disappear from reality at the end of the opponent's fight phase, and then come down in your own reserves, maybe with a 1 command point to drop just outside of 3 inches, to potentially land something terrifying like a Nightbringer or a Void Dragon deep in your opponent's lines. If you can put them somewhere to make their shooting at least somewhat useful in that turn, and also keep them from being focused down by literally the entire opponent's army, that could be enormously disruptive. You could be marching up and killing things holding their home field objective, and force the opponent to send a bunch of units back to try and deal with them, which is going to be no small task with these units and their healing. You could have both a Nightbringer and a Transcendent CTan landing right by the enemy turn 2 if needed. Otherwise, the Awakened Dynasty has a stratagem that allows you reroll hit rolls of a 1 when shooting against enemies on objectives, and there are a few other units that might potentially help them out. I guess maybe the biggest things could be things that could potentially regenerate them a few more wounds, say the Technomancer or the Canoptech Reanimator. I feel like both of those are maybe things that you more want to support other units if you're using them though, just due to potentially having difficulty coordinating them with a Catan if they're going to be charging off into combat and things. If you did have a Technomancer unit moving up the board though, then going alongside a Catan might not be the worst thing ever. They seem like it's just a ridiculously good value target for their healing. If you can just opportunistically sidle up to one as you're moving up, and then fill it up with a few more wounds. I guess in theory the Silent King could give them some rerolls as well. Maybe feels like you might be going a little bit too heavy on big centerpiece units if you say had him supporting a Catan or two. I guess that'd just be loads of force in one section of the board. I feel like between him and the Catan he's supporting though, you'd probably nicely destroy just about any objective they were trying to take though. You would significantly increase their damage. Overall though, I don't really think that those things are particularly necessary, just maybe nice to have if you have them elsewhere in the army, and it happens to line up positioning wise on the board. Let me know what you make of the Catan though. Necron players out there, are you looking to include one or more in lists at the moment? And if so, which ones are your favourite ones? Is it going to be the Nightbringer, Deceiver, Void Dragon or Transcendant, or some combination of the above? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.